guys. As I promised in the summer, we were going to do our 1815 May campaign, which I know a lot of you have enjoyed us watching that through to conclusion. And after that, we were hoping that Dave Brown's 1813 Germany campaign scenarios would also be released. So we're going to be playing a bunch of those this autumn, and we'll be playing those in the historic order, and there is some slight benefits that you get if you succeed or are defeated in each one of these scenarios that you roll forward into the future battles. So we'll be incorporating that and having a sort of mini campaign system. The scenarios include Bautzen, Lutzen, bits of Leipzig, and several other campaign games, but start with Weissenfels. So this was one of the opening engagements in the 1813 campaign, and Ney launched his or the first part of Napoleon's assault with his corps into Saxony, and this was the very first engagement. A lot of the French troops were conscripts and never had come under fire before. So if we have a look at the game as it's deployed, we have 5 brigades for the French. We have 2 on table, 1 brigade here of 4 battalions of recruits, and another brigade over there of 4 battalions of recruits. We have part of a light cavalry brigade. There's a 2nd regiment, should be of the Baden Dragoons, but I don't have any Baden Dragoons. So it'll actually be 2 regiments of French Hussars, rather than 1 of Dragoons and 1 of Hussars. And they're supported by a medium artillery battery on this hill in the centre. Fighting these, we have a brigade of Russian line infantry, 4 battalions here. 1 deployed forward of the river in this village. 2nd one holding the river crossing, and this village here. And then we have a brigade of Jaegers on the left, supported by a Russian small cavalry brigade of 1 small and 1 regular dragoon regiment. And we also have, not yet properly deployed, the Hussars, which are on the table for the photographing I did a few moments ago. The Russians have no further reserves. They have to simply hold their positions for 12 turns. The French have to break through the Russian lines and in theory capture a village further to the rear, but we haven't built a deep table today, so it'll simply be breaking the Russian lines are their objectives. This stream is difficult terrain. Formed units can only cross at the bridges or at the fords, but light troops, and the French do have a brigade of light troops as well as all their skirmish screens, can cross the river at any point. The qualities of the troops, I've talked a bit about the French. So we have 2 regiments of recruits on the table, and then we have a regiment of légers, they're of standard quality, line quality, and another brigade of infantry, they are also of line quality, and the Hussars for the French are also of line quality. So fairly reasonable force. For the Russians, the infantry regiments counts as reservists. So 1 step between the line and the quality of the core French units and the recruits that are currently on the table. The Jaegers for the Russians are of line quality, and the cavalry are also line quality, but campaign cavalry, so not on great quality mounts. For the French, their cavalry, the small regiment of Hussars on the table is battle cavalry, and the 2nd one will also be campaign cavalry. So the general shortage of good quality mounts following the 1812 campaign across Europe is playing out in this game today. All right, I hope you enjoy the game, and we'll be back with turn. So we've rolled for ADC activation, and the French, despite having the potential of 5 active brigades, only rolled 2 ADCs. But they were lucky, and they allocated infantry assault to this brigade to try and clear this village to get their assault rolling, and they have succeeded in that. Their other infantry brigade over here is active, but unfortunately their cavalry brigade on the flank is hesitant, so they'll be at -1 to the initiative roll. For the Russians, we got 3 active ADCs, however we failed every single test. So the Russians are at 3, and the French are at -1. The Russians go from a 10 down to a 7, and the Russians go, the French go from an 8 down to a 7. So that's a draw. Let's roll again as it's the first turn. And the French get a 7 and the Russians get a 5. So the French have initiative in this first turn. Let's see if they do any charges. Right. At the end of turn 1, the Hussars remain in reserve to the Russian second line reservist brigade that are holding the village. The battalion in the village here has been charged. This 1st French battalion, supported by the engineers of the division, have charged in. So we do get a defensive volley. So 3 shots from the Russians. We cause 1 casualty on that attacking battalion, which we'll mark up. But that's not enough to stop them charging in. So we will have an assault against this village in the first turn as that French brigade charges in with 1 battalion, but 2 supports are available. Over here, as we move across the table, this 2nd French brigade has moved up to the river and the ford, trying to force their way across the ford. Cavalry have remained unmoved, but for the Russians, position for the infantry remains where they are, but our dragoons, 2 regiments of dragoons have moved up to potentially counterattack if the French make it across the river there. So that's it for all movement. We'll now start with artillery, French firing to go first. The best target for the French is indeed these Russian guns that are down here in front of them. This will be at -3 because it's a deployed battery in cover at effective range. So that's a 5. That'll go down, an 8 goes down to a 5. That, I think, at effective range will be 1 casualty on the gun. So final shots of the turn. We did counter battery fire and rolled an 11 with the Russian artillery. And they caused a discipline test and caused the French to lose 2 casualties and go unformed on their horse artillery battery of the hill, on the hill. So the Russians winning the start of the artillery exchange. Right, let's do the assault on the village. So the French get 4 dice. They reduce it by 1 for attacking the village, and they reduce it by 1 for being recruits. The Russians are reservists, so they'll still be fighting at full strength, but the French do have engineers, so they will get an extra dice. So 4 dice to 5. Let's see how we do. Russians do outstandingly. They cause 5 casualties on the French. French only do 1 in return, and the French will be driven off. Turn 2, we've rolled for initiative. The French have initiative and they have all their brigades active. They have put infantry assault on this brigade on their right. They retain infantry assault on the brigade to the left, and they will be able to bring their unit that retreated off the table back on using our house rule. Our cavalry are active for the French this turn. Unfortunately for the Russians, their cavalry for the Dragoon regiment has gone hesitant. So that's where we are. Let's start with any charges by the French. On the French right, one of the French battalions is deployed into line to pin and exchange gunfire with this Russian battalion on the other side of the river. A 2nd battalion has started marching across the ford, just starting to approach this far side of the ford, and a 3rd battalion has run forward across the stream to get into a position to potentially attack the village next turn, and the French skirmishers have pushed forward in advance of those attacking columns. We'll expose them to some volleys from the Russians over here, but we'll allow them to put pressure on the Russian guns. Otherwise, we've got a new French brigade of light infantry arriving in the centre, and another attack has gone in against the village. All right, let's see what happens as we move on to firing French to go first. The French guns have just opened fire and caused an 8, so a raw 11, -3 for firing at batteries in cover. So that's 2 casualties against the Russians. That takes them up to 4, so they won't be able to do artillery assault anymore, and a discipline test at -1. They roll a double 6, so they are fine. The Russian guns will be able to respond. All right, any other firing? We fired the French skirmisher screen. That caused a casualty on the guns, but otherwise I think we're going to hold off. We will do an inferior volley for this battalion that's deployed in line. So this will be an inferior volley at -1. We roll a 7. I think that'll be nothing. That's a 6. No, it is 1 casualty against the Russians that are in line down here. All right, so the Russian garrison has opened fire, and it's rolled a double 6 and a 4. So that's 2 casualties against the attacking French battalion, and that will be a discipline test because we've rolled a double 6. They roll a 6, so the attacking battalion will go unformed, and the Russians will probably maintain their hold in this village. Fired their first garrison, they'll fire their second garrison. They're not being assaulted, but they can do defensive fire, and they do well as well. They get a double 5. They'll do 2 casualties against this French battalion, and then we'll do some counter battery fire again from these guns, see if we can do well. Looks good, it was a 6, but only a 1 subsequently, so 7 minus 2 is going down to a 4 at effective ranges, no effect. All right, so we'll 2 casualties on this battalion, and then finally we'll do a volley from our Russian musketeers across the river against that French battalion that formed up. Okay, we roll an 8 for a standard volley through the hedge line, so it'll take it down to a 7. That is 2 casualties against the French battalion on the far left of the Russian. The assault on the village, the French look certain to lose this one, so they start with 5 dice. Their recruits, that takes them down to 4. Their unformed, that takes them down to 3, and they're attacking a built-up area, that takes them down to 2. The Russians still get 5. So the French don't do any casualties. Unfortunately for the Russians, they only do 1. So that does allow the French to fight a second round of combat, and they can throw their supports into this assault this time. So this time the Russians will be in real trouble. As this battalion is a forlorn hope for the Russians, this is probably their swan song. They do get a full 5 dice, but the French get 12 dice this time because they are attacking. They're not 12, actually only 10 dice, because they're attacking with 2 more battalions of recruits, and the damaged unformed battalion will keep fighting as well. Let's see how we do. Right, so the Russians don't do very well this time. They only cause 1 casualty. The French have caused 4. They will eject the Russians from the village and capture it themselves. Where we are in turn 2, the Russian right flank still looks pretty strong, really. We've got plenty of battalions here formed up against the river line. We've got our battalion that was ejected from the river that's flooded back across the bridge. They'll have the opportunity to reform this turn, and we have our cavalry in support to counter-attack. The French have got a fairly mauled battalion that has advanced into the village. 2 others that are still formed and ready to pursue the attack. They've got their light brigade that's just come on in the centre, and they're swarming across the river on the right flank to try and make a difference here. All right, that's it for turn 2. Let's see what happens as we move into turn 3. French rolled well. They got 4 ADCs. They put infantry assault on their Leger brigade that's coming on in the centre. So all their infantry brigades have infantry assault, and all brigades are active. For the Russians, we had 3 active ADCs, but despite having re-rolls, both our infantry brigades went hesitant, and only our cavalry is active. So it'll be -2 on the Russians. So they go from a 9 to a 7. The French are on a 6. So the Russians do get initiative and the option of acting first. Let's see what they're going to do. Right, starting off on the Russian left, the 2 regiments of dragoons have counterattacked the French trying to cross the ford over here. The Russian skirmishers will have deployed forward back into the river line, having driven out by an attacking French battalion last turn. So let's put them back in there. So Russian skirmishers back in the river. That infantry battalion remains in place, and the dragoons have counter-attacked on the left flank. Left here, we hold this building as a strong point, and this line behind the fencing here. The French have pushed their first column across the ford. Rather than attacking the village, it's swung left to potentially put pressure on the flank of this gun line. The French skirmishers, which should be a bit further forward because they need to have a 3-inch gap to be effective, continuing to put pressure on those guns. A second French battalion hiding away there is coming across the ford as well to support the assault. In the centre, the Leger are now moving up to the river line, and indeed the Leger's skirmishers are into the river, and the other battery both batteries continue to face off against one another. The French are also resuming the assault on their far left, with the previous unit that retreated off table is now available again and has come back on table. The Russians have reformed their retreating battalion, having lost the first of the villages. Right, so the Russians have initiative. First thing will be charge responses, and there will be a defensive volley from that French column as it was charged by the Russians coming across the river. All right, so this will be at half effect. That'll be a 5. At half effect will be nothing. So no casualties as the French cavalry come charging in. Let's see what the charge results are as the Dragoons have their first outing and their first combat as a newly painted unit. Can they break this French column? Let's see. So this will simply be a +2 to the French as they are an infantry column in column. The French get a reroll because they have a, the Dragoons get a reroll because they have a support. The French, although it looks like perhaps they've got a support, can't be supported by cavalry, and this other unit is actually further away. It's just because of the difficulty of the terrain. The other infantry companies are all bunched up behind the front line, so there are no supports for the French. Let's see how we do. The Russians get a 6, the French get a 5. We'll re-roll the 2. The Russians get an 8, the French get a 5. The French, and modify that so that's a +1 result for cavalry versus infantry. Cavalry will melee with a lan, and the defenders with melee unformed. There is a chance here for these Dragoons to be successful. All right, let's see what happens next. Once they've completed their firing, actually, their skirmishers did remarkably well. So this screen over here caused a further 2 casualties on this French battalion lined up against the river line. That takes them up to 4. And then we just rolled a 5 and a 6 for the garrison in this building. That affected 3 more casualties onto this infantry battalion, which takes them up to 5. So good effect from that. The French, however, were undamaged when shot at by the Russian artillery, and the Russian line battalion here to go against the French skirmishers, but had no effect there. All right, now time for some French return fire. We'll do the light infantry skirmish screen here. We've got 4 bases going against the Russians behind the hedge line. 2 6s, that's 2 casualties on the Russians. Not a bad start. Okay, then we've got 2 shots against the Russian skirmisher screen in front of the guns. That causes no effect. We'll fire a volley at -1, and it'll be -2 because of their casualties from this French line against the skirmishers. A 6 will be no effect. And then we will fire these 3 skirmisher bases against the Russian guns. Let's see what we can do. Wow, another good bit of firing. That is 3 more casualties. This gun battery is nearly broken. That's 7 casualties. 1 more and they will be gone. That will be not good news and a falter test for the Russians. All right, final thing to fire. Well, we might as well have a go doing some counter battery fire at -3 from the French guns on the hill. They roll well again. That's going to be enough. That's a 10. That goes down to a 7 at effective range, which I think is simply 1 casualty. Let's just check that. At effective range, a 7 is 1 casualty against the guns. That takes these guns up to 8 casualties. That battery is dispersed, and the first loss in the game as the Russian gun battery limbers up and pulls out. The Russians do as they charge into this unformed French battalion crossing the river. That's looking good for the Russians. So the French infantry cause 2 casualties, but the Russian cavalry cause 5. That'll cause that infantry battalion to disperse, and the Russians get the option to take. Okay, so the Russian cavalry now dominates the ford on this left flank, but could be counterattacked by the French hussars. The Russians, however, have lost their guns, and this right flank will have to take a falter test this turn. All right, some critical ADC rolls as we crack on with turn 4. Let's see. Film our ADC activations as they're potentially critical, because we need to allocate some of these to falter tests. All right, so both sides have enough. So 4 ADCs for the French, 3 for the Russians. We'll activate 2 to our hesitant brigade, and we'll activate 1 to our cavalry brigade. Let's start activating. Cavalry brigade is indeed active. The infantry brigade on the left is active. Let's do our falter test for the Russian infantry regiment. Gets a 6. It obeys orders. That couldn't have gone better for the Russians. Okay, so activating the Leger, they're active. Activating the brigade on the far right flank, it is hesitant. Activating the Hussars, they are active. Now those last two both had rerolls. Now our falter test for our brigade that attacked the village, a 2, we'll need to reroll. A 4. I think that'll be a retire result, but not a disaster for the French. Turn 5, the Russians are continuing their counterattack, so the Russian Dragoons have charged across the river here, hitting this unit of French Hussars. Both the Russians and the French have supports there. The French brigade on this flank of recruits has no orders for infantry assault anymore, as it's gone hesitant and had to retire this turn, so we'll have to redeploy that order next turn. But the 2 battalions here on the left of that brigade have just recoiled a bit. Russians are firmly in control of this position here. Across in the centre, the French have broken one of their Leger battalions down into a skirmish screen to try and push across the river and put more pressure on this big gap in the Russian centre. Otherwise, the brigades on the far left of the French position, the right as you're looking at it here, have gone hesitant. The Russians remain secure in this right flank, counter-attacking on the left, looking good for them at the moment. Let's see what happens as we play through turn 5. For this charge by the Russian dragoons, it's +1 to the French because they are battle cavalry as opposed to campaign cavalry, so this unit of French hussars is the only better mounted unit in the game. Right, the French roll a 7, the Russians roll a 7, so that is a -1 charge result, and a -1 cavalry versus cavalry. We go straight into a melee and a counter charge, so then that will be concluded in the melee section of the turn. Alright, let's move on, and firing first by the Russians. For our cavalry combat over here, remember if there's a draw, we'll be able to put our support into the action as well. Let's see how we do. It's a straight roll off. French do quite well, they cause 3 casualties. Russians do well as well, they cause 4. Alright, let's see what happens on a difference of 1. The dragoons are victorious and drive the hussars from the field. It's looking good for the Russians on this left. So the French have got initiative, but gosh, they need it. They're in real trouble over on their left flank. On the right, the attack is stalled, although the French have plenty of skirmishers out trying to whittle down the strength of the Russian opposition, and they still have their artillery battery. Over here on the left, the Russians look in good place. No casualties really at all against their battalions. They've broken one of the French. This battalion over here looks very exposed, and we have 2 cavalry regiments roving around in the French rear with the French cavalry brigade destroyed and driven off table. All right, let's see what happens. French to go. So for the Russians, this Russian line that was in the field has now started advancing to put pressure on the French. The French themselves have started pulling back because they're running the risk of being charged in the flank and the rear by the Russian dragoons. The Russian skirmish screens continue to move forward to put pressure on that French line there. This French line had pulled back a bit because it was taking heavy fire from the garrison and this Russian line here, and its skirmish screens getting whittled away. This second French battalion, which was crossing the river, has now had to form square as the 2 Russian dragoons have swung round. In response, the French artillery battery that was on the hill has decided to do a voluntary retire, so it's on an emergency limber and pulled back off the table, otherwise it's going to get charged and probably destroyed next turn. The French Leger battalion that was exposed just the other side of the river has moved across the river as it was in skirmish formation, so it can do that. Another Leger battalion has moved into square there. There is no Russian artillery, so all right for that. And then the conscripts on the far flank have decided to renew the assault and are coming across the river. Let's see how they do. At the moment, the French have decided not to commit their reserve brigade. I'm not really sure where to deploy it at this point in time. Doing the Russian firing, and we caused 1 casualty on this French skirmish screen here. We caused another casualty on this French skirmish screen here. Our skirmishers themselves realised that they had a target of that square they could fire at, and they did really well. They caused 3 casualties against that. And we've just done three shots from this garrison in the building. They caused 3 more casualties, 2 5s, a 5 and 2 6s on this French battalion in column. That takes them up to 9 casualties. They then had to take a discipline test, which they failed, the roll of 3, so they've got to retreat, and they take D3 casualties, so they take another 3, so that battalion disintegrates, and that'll be a fatigue test against this brigade, and this brigade is now directed to turn 7. It's looking increasingly dicey for the French. Okay, wow, French only get 2 ADCs. They'll need both of them for their falter test, and the Russians will get 2 ADCs as well. All right, let's allocate those ADCs and we'll see how those falter tests do. Unfortunately for the Russians, although probably not a great impact now, the Dragoons are hesitant, but they're effectively pinning the French over on this left-hand flank. On the right, both on the right and on the left, our basic infantry regiments are active for the Russians. Now let's roll our falter test for our faltering right-hand brigade. A 2 and a 3. They will retire off table. The brigade was broken anyway. That's it for the right-hand element of the French 7, and the Russians retain initiative. Let's see what they do, and the French, what their skirmish fires on the line, but most importantly, we've got the charge results too. So, defensive fire from this Russian column, they roll a 7, which will be at half effect. A standard volley is 2 casualties, so that is 1 casualty attacking against the attacking French column. But I think they're in column. We get an extra combat dice, so let's see if we get an extra casualty from that. We do, so that's 2 casualties against the attacking French. Right, let's see how the charge. So this will simply be -1 to the French. They also get a -1 for being recruits, but you offset that because they are attacking in column. Both sides get a reroll, and French will be on -1. Let's see how they do as they charge across the river. Right, so the French, I think we'll have to re-roll that one, that definitely is cocked. So the French get a 5, the Russians get an 8. We'll use the first Russian re-roll. Wow, they're on an 11. They're going to stay on that. The French will do their first re-roll, a 9, and their second re-roll, an 11 as well. So that becomes a 10, so that's a charge result of -1. So the attackers stop and volley, so they simply do 1 volley. 1 shot against the Russians. They do cause a casualty against the Russians, but fail to charge. At that point, we're going to call it Napoleon's offensive under Ney. This branch of the offensive, anyway, has stalled. They haven't been able to drive these Russian reservists away from the river. The Russian Jaegers have held the other crossing, and the Russian Dragoons, new units, have belied the new unit's reputation and done really well, smashing across the river crossing, breaking 1 French battalion, breaking a French light cavalry brigade, forcing an artillery battery to withdraw, and the French attack as a result has been stymied. All right, hope you've enjoyed this small game. See you all again next time. Cheers everyone, bye.